Hey, church, happy 4th of July. I just wanted to say that we miss you and hope you're enjoying this Sabbath rest Sunday. And, I miss us gathering together and I miss the time of fellowship, but I also know that God honors us taking rest and us spending some time together with friends and family. And so I hope you're doing that. And our prayer for this Sabbath rest Sunday on the 4th of July is that it wouldn't just be a break from church or us not gathering together, but we would gather in a different way, that we would spend time with family that maybe we haven't seen or with friends, and that we'd really press into relationships together. One of the things that I know God is calling us out of right now is out of isolation and back into community. And that's a challenge for some people, and we know that. And it has been a challenge. And so one of the things that God's really been speaking to me that I want to reiterate to our church is that we are not called to isolation anymore. We aren't called to isolation long term. We might have been isolated for a season, but God is calling us back into relationships, and God wants to honor that. And so take this Sabbath Sunday and spend time together, be with people, be in relationship. I'm going to share a message here in a minute that I preached and appropriately on community and why community is important and why we're called to unify together and to work together, and how the early church broke bread together and they spent their lives together. They wasn't about just coming to a service or watching service online. And that's one of the things I hear all the time is that I can get church anywhere. I can watch church anywhere. I can do church anywhere. And yes, you can. You can get a message. You can go find whatever you're looking for. But you're missing a huge part of what the church is. And it's a place that we can gather together and we can fellowship. We can encourage one another. We can be in relationship. And so take a few minutes this morning. Take, 30, 40 minutes and watch this sermon. Spend some time and just listen to what the Lord will be speaking about, how we can be that church, how even though that was thousands of years ago, God is still calling us to be the same church today. And that's a church that does life together. We are better together. We can encourage each other. We can be in His presence. And, it's a church that is a community and walks and does everything together. And so I want us to be that. I want you to be that. That's where I believe God is really calling us this year, is out of isolation, back into community. And so enjoy Sabbath Rest Sunday. Enjoy being with friends. Call someone, invite them over, grill out, run and grab some food. Grocery stores will be crazy, but grab something, grab some food, grill out, invite a neighbor over, go have a conversation, do whatever. We just had last night, bunch of people in the front yard, sparklers, neighbors brought glow sticks over. People, it was so much fun watching the fireworks. Man, God is in the midst of that, and He's calling us. So if you felt isolated this year, if you felt alone, you have not abandoned. God is with you, but God is calling you out of that. Don't get comfortable in the isolation. Watch this sermon. Let it bless you. We will see you next Sunday at 10. Also, if you want to give still this week, you can. If you want to fill out a Connect card, let us know what's going on. Do that. Don't miss the opportunity to live generously, and let's do it together, even though it's a rest Sunday. Let's honor God with our time, our talent, our treasure. Let's be the light. Let's be the body of Christ. Enjoy this sermon. Enjoy this message. Hope it blesses you, and we'll see you soon. Have an awesome 4th of July. See you next Sunday at 10.
When I say the church, I want you to wrap your head around the idea. We aren't talking about the ministry of Anchor, the church in that way. We're talking about the church internally, us, every one of us in this room. And what would it look like if the church lived out selfless generosity? And so I know when we talk about generosity, when that subject comes up, there's some people who get kind of weird in church. And so we're not just talking about money. So I want to get that out of the way on the front end. But we were talking about what would the world look like? What would our community look like? What would our neighborhoods look like? Schools, all of those things, if we started living like the Church of Acts. And when Jesus left and left the earth, he commissioned his church to go forth and make disciples in all the nations. And we are still walking in that command today. And so what would our community look like? What would we look like? And a major part of generosity stems out of grace. And it was intentional that we started by talking about grace and we moved to this series. Because if you don't understand grace, you can't understand full generosity. Because it's only because of generosity that we receive the grace that we get. That's why we take communion, right? God has been so generous to us that we celebrate, we remember the generosity of God. And so as a church, we want to talk about this subject because it is one of our values. It is one of the things we value as a community. If you go on our website, we have all of our values listed on there. And generosity is one of them. And in our value for generosity, it says, we live generously. Our time, talents, and resources are given to us as a gift, and we want to steward those gifts well. We believe we're called to give sacrificially and practice generosity. When we live in this way, we believe God then trusts us with more. And so we're believing that this series is not just going to be a great series for our church, but I really believe it's going to be a blessing to you. Because I think when you learn to live in this way, when you start to practice generosity with your time, giving selflessly with your talents and your treasure, I believe you get a blessing back from God. And sometimes that message can get kind of twisted and think like, oh, well, I gave this, so where's it coming? And blessings come in different ways. And so we're going to dig into that a little bit. And specifically financially in this series, we as a church are going to be taking a step of faith. And I want to share that with you this morning. On the last Sunday of this month, which I believe is the 25th, so it's the Sunday after Thanksgiving, I'm doing a teaching on trusting God, being generous with our treasure. And that's always a hard series for people. But as a community, if we are going to value generosity and say it's an emphasis for us, then we want to practice that. And so on that Sunday, just so you guys can be prepared, on November 25th, we are giving 100% of our offering away. And some of you guys are like, okay, we are 7 weeks into a brand new church. And every week, offering is what makes sure that we can keep going with church. But we prayed about it as we were going into this series, and we said, you know what? We want to be a blessing. And so there's a missionary in Panama. His name's Garrett Kenyon. I'm good friends with him. I've taken student trips down to serve with him. They have launched, right in the middle of the city of Panama, a ministry center for teenagers. And it's a place where teenagers can come that have been sexually abused, and they can document it and try to get them help. It's a place where kids can come to get out of gangs and violence, and they can come focus on their studies. They have a whole ministry set up within this center where students can come and do their homework and get tutoring and get help. They run a church out of it. They're doing amazing things in the schools. God's given them favor in the schools where they can go in. They have more favor than the government in some ways in the schools. They can go in and share the gospel on a daily basis. And so we are going to try to bless them. They're in need of 3 IMACs in their ministry center. And I'm believing our community, our brand new 7-weekend church plant, is going to be able to bless them and say, here you go, Garrett. We're providing all of your IMACs so that kids can come. They can get an education. They can get tutored and ultimately receive the gospel. And so on the 25th, come prepared to give your tithe, but also give above and beyond. And we'll be able to bless their ministry. Garrett is also going to be the first global missionary as a church that we're going to bring on monthly. So we believe that God has positioned us here, and we are not trying to just store up, but we're trying to send out. And so we are going to partner. We are going to become friends with them. You'll probably see Garrett at some point come in and teach, but we are going to come alongside of them and say, hey, we're with you. We believe in the ministry you're doing. And there'll be videos, and we'll give a little bit more direction. But on the 25th, we are going to be kind of putting our money where our mouth is because it's foundational. This series is really foundational for who we are and who we want to be. And so I hope you're taking notes. I hope you're with us. If you have friends that miss, everything gets podcasted every week, or you can find the videos on the app. But we're going to get right into it today. If you have your Bibles, turn to the book of Acts. That's where we're going to be, Acts chapter 2. And this passage has really been foundational to my Christian walk because it gives us the best picture of what the church should look like. And a lot of times in church, it's easy to get distracted and caught up in all the things that need to be done, or even in our personal lives. I have 2 kids. I have a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old, and it's easy to be like, well, someone's sick and throwing up, or I got to get someone to soccer practice, or parent-teacher conferences, and all the things that happen, and we got to go grocery shopping every other day because they just don't stop eating. Any parents in the room, you know what I'm talking about. It's like my daughter smashed like a whole plate of pancakes yesterday, and I'm like, you're this big, where did it all go? And it's nonstop, the things that are going on, even if you don't have kids, if you're in college, right? Seth, who's like my adopted college student, he lives in our basement, he's an intern at the church. It's like nonstop, he's writing forms and papers and playing video games, and he's not quite as busy as he thinks he is, and I give him a hard time about it. But it's nonstop, the things that happen in life, and as you get older, it just gets more and more and more, and you just get more and more busy. And it's funny, my mom is about to retire, and she jokes, she's like, I thought it was going to get easier when I got to retirement. And she's like, no, I just have new things that I have to get done. And they live on 8 acres and have a farm, and it's just go, 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 go for them all the time. But it's easy to get caught up, and we don't pause and reflect on God, how God called us to live in the church in this sense, or in our lives as the church. And we can get really distracted and off track. And so Acts 2:42 is a great reminder, specifically for our community. Acts 2:42 is a great reminder of what God has called us to be as the church. And so I want to read it this morning. If you have your Bibles, get them out. If not, digitally you can get a Bible on our app, or it's on the screen. And it says this: they devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. Although the believers were together and had everything in common. Verse 45, they sold property and possessions. That's a hard one, right? What if some of you went home and God said, sell your house, and you're just going to have faith that I'm going to provide something for you? I don't know if I would have that much faith, right? I got 2 kids. But this says they sold their property and possessions and gave to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all people. And the Lord added to their numbers daily those who were being saved. This is a real clear verse in the Bible that shows what God designed the church to be. And I was thinking back to my life and all the things that I've done, and I've been really blessed. God has given me a lot of opportunity. But I remember about a little over 12 years ago, I did something crazy. I was in college in Florida, and God kind of put on my heart to go and volunteer for a nonprofit that was rescuing child soldiers out of a rebel army in Uganda. And so I quit school and I moved to California, which sounds really great. You're like, yeah, that doesn't sound so bad. I moved to San Diego, California, which is the most beautiful place on the planet, I'm convinced. Best temperature ever, 75 degrees all the time. There's 1 month where it rains. It's amazing. And so I sold a bunch of stuff that I had, packed up, flew across the country, and when I got there, I was like, yeah, California, this is great. And I showed up at the house where I was going to live, and I walk into this house. It was a 3-bedroom house, and there were about 15 people who lived in the house. If you've ever been to California or you lived in California, you know how much it costs to live in California. And so the company that I was working for, they said, we're going to cram as many people to the point that it's almost not safe into a house because it's that expensive. And I remember there were multiple bunk beds in rooms. Like, there was no personal space. If you're one of those people that you like your bubble and you don't like people to invade it, this was your worst nightmare. There was no privacy anywhere. I remember at one point I slept on a janky old couch on the back porch because there was I just needed a break. I'm like, I'm going to sleep outside on the couch. And we were crammed in this house. All the introverts in the room, you're cringing right now. You're like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. If you're an extrovert, you're like, that sounds amazing. I'm an extrovert, and it still had its moments. And But we crammed in this house, and as I look back on that time, there were stressful moments and hard moments, but there were awesome moments that happened being in a house with that many people. We would have community dinners where we would get together and not, it wouldn't be like, oh, you're in charge to provide dinner. Everybody would bring something. And so there was always that friend that was really cheap that would bring like a bag of potato chips, but we loved them anyway. And then there was that other friend like my wife that'll go above and beyond and like make something like chip dip from scratch. And you're like, why'd you make it from scratch? You should have just went and bought it. But my wife, that's how she is. She will make, it doesn't matter if it's for like little kindergartners, she will make the best cookies for kindergartners. And I'm like, they're just going to shove it in their face and half of it will be on the floor. But that's how she's wired. And so we would have these community dinners where everybody would bring food and we'd sit around and we'd just laugh for hours. Or one of the things we love to do was play, anybody ever play Mario Soccer on the GameCube? Some of you guys are like, what's a GameCube? And it was like part 3 of Nintendo. And we would play Mario Soccer and we would get in fights, but then at the end we'd like love each other and we'd be like yelling. But we would just have so much fun. The community that would happen was amazing. And there were times where we'd stay up all night and people would just be there for one another and talk with each other and we just did life together. And as I read Acts 2:42, I can't help but think this is how God designed the church to be. Where there's no personal space or agenda, it's just selflessly living and focused. And this morning I want to talk, what does that look like in our lives? Because for some of us, that's a challenge. For some of us, we want our time or we want our space, or I worked hard to have my house, right? I don't want people coming in and messing up my world. I just want to stay on my mission. But it says in Acts that God is calling us to something very different. And I think if we want to see a change in the world, if we want to see people around us change, if we want to be a beacon of hope in our community, it starts by living an authentic Acts 2:42 type of faith. And so this morning we're going to get into that. And if you're a note taker or you're following along with us, we're just going to work our way through Acts 2:42 through 47. And I think as a community, this verse is foundational to us. If you came in this morning, you saw "You belong on everything." It's kind of our adopted slogan. And we authentically want to be that type of church where we say, it doesn't matter where you come from, what you came with, what you're dragging behind you, what's in front of you. And it's because we have a belief that there's something better, that God is calling us to a better way of life together. And so the first thing is we're looking at Acts 2:42. The first point I want to pull out of this verse is when we worship together, we grow together. When we worship together, we grow together. Acts 2:42 through 43, it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. Me and Bo were standing backstage as we were worshiping, and man, there's just something special about being in the presence of God. And for some people that's uncomfortable, but there's something special about engaging with a God that isn't just up in heaven ruling down on us, but is actively involved around and everywhere. That'll come down to Southview High School, Sylvania, Ohio. I mean, we would think of a king, right? A king or a ruler, they want to go to New York City or LA or where things are awesome, but that's not God. God will come down in the presence of a small village in Eastern Africa, or come down to Sylvania, Ohio. He wants to be with us and engaging with us. And there's something special about engaging with the presence of God. And when we worship together, our alignment gets focused on the right thing. That's why worship is so important. People wonder, if you go to church, there's kind of like this unspoken order of things. You come in and you do worship, and then you kind of move through the service, and that's how every church does it. But there's a reason, there's a science to it. The reason we worship before we get to the message, or even before we get to announcements or anything, is because the hope is that we get our alignment on the same thing. When we worship together, our alignment gets focused on the same thing. And when we come together, there are people from all different backgrounds. Kevin Ham, who's out there greeting every week, he lives in West Toledo. I live in Sylvania. Those are two very different communities. But when we come together and we worship together, and none of that matters. Our alignment is focused on Christ. And I've seen this in our life. I've been a youth pastor for a long time, and you see it in good ways and bad ways. Because the people you get around will have an influence on you. Bo's kids are perfect about this. Bo grew up in Ohio, diehard Ohio State fan, grew up in Canton, Ohio with his wife. They love the Buckeyes, but his son has grown up in Sylvania his whole life, and for some unknown reason is a Michigan fan. I would kick that child out of my house. He'd be put up for adoption. And his son is a Michigan fan, and it's because we are on the line. It is 50-50 in this area, Michigan, Ohio State. Some of you will say it's a little more Michigan, but I'm going to believe it's 50-50. And but his son has been influenced by his community. In college, I went to school in Florida, and my roommate, anybody ever get an accidental roommate? And that's always a risk, right? Like someone that just got thrown in, like your roommate quit school, and then they're like, oh, we're putting you with this random person. It's like freshman year all over again. My freshman year roommate, this isn't even in my notes. It's just randomly coming into my head. But my roommate, my freshman year of college, used to read me poetry as we were laying in bunk. I'd be laying in my bunk, and he'd be like, Brent, I wrote this poem today, and I was like, oh, God, help me right now. I would just lay in my blanket like, God, please let him stop. We switched. I got a new roommate halfway through the year. But God, I hope he doesn't watch this podcast somehow. But he would read me poetry. And I remember my junior year of college, my roommate decided not to come back, and I got stuck with a rando roommate. And I was like, oh gosh, this is going to be poetry slam all over again. And but I ended up getting stuck in with this guy named Brandon, who ended up becoming one of my best friends in the whole world. Brandon transferred from the University of Florida. And God had called him to do ministry work, and so he left the University of Florida, came to Southeastern, and he was studying to be a doctor so that he could go do missions work in Africa. And I was an Ohio State fan my whole life, but he was a diehard Florida Gators fan. And it was like orange and blue everywhere in our dorm room. And after getting around for him a while, he'd start inviting me up to games in Gainesville. And so we started going to Gators games. Well, after a few times, I started to become a Gators fan. Like it started to wear on you. Now, on all honesty, it was during the Tim Tebow era. So it was like easy to become a Gators fan because they were winning and awesome, and he loves Jesus. It's like Chick-fil-A. You have to like it. And like if you hate Tim Tebow, then God's judging you, I think. And that's not true. I'm just kidding. But he is judging you if you hate Chick-fil-A. And but I became this Gators fan, and I started buying jerseys and going to games because it rubs off on you when you get around people. People's attitudes rub off on you. But what people care about rubs off on you. You know, we love Fallon Fodder on our staff, and I didn't give Carlos or anyone else a choice. I just said, we're going to love this place, and they love it. Because when you get around people, you start to like the same things, care about the same things, believe the same things. And it's no different with our walk with Christ. See, we worship so that our focus can get set on the right thing. When we come together, it doesn't matter what part of town you came from, what you came in with, what you care about, what religious background you have or denomination or any of that stuff, because we can all agree that Jesus is the best part of life. And so we worship together to get our focus right. We understand the importance of it. And I hear people say all the time, well, I don't need to go to church to be a Christian. Some of you guys have heard that said before. Well, I just don't want to go to church. I don't need to do it to be a Christian. God still loves me. And there is some truth to that. Yes, God still loves you even if you don't go to church. But wouldn't you rather be in a life raft with 50 people trying to survive in the ocean than by yourself just getting beaten by the waves? God designed us to worship, to live together, because there's a strength when we align ourselves together. We weren't designed to do it alone. We were designed to move through this thing together, and that moves on to Acts 2:44. It says, all the believers were together and had everything in common. See, they celebrated what they had in common, the gospel, rather than what divided them. They celebrated what they had in common, Jesus, rather than what divided them. And this is a hard one for the church. If I'm just going to be honest and authentic for a minute, we have a hard time with this if we're being truthful. Because we like to set up systems when we come into church. Well, you have to go through this, and oh, you don't do communion every week, or oh, you sing those worship songs, or like you were there on Friday night, you were hanging out with those. And we like to set up all these hoops that you have to jump through to be involved in the church. And Acts says they didn't focus on what divided them. It says Jews and Gentiles in the book of Acts were coming together, and God was growing their ministry. Why? Because they knew what the number one thing was. They knew what was most important. Jesus was number one. And a lot of times as a church, we want to focus on everything else. We want to say, well, you're a Democrat. You can't love Jesus, right? That's a big one. Or you voted for this person, or you drank that, or you ate that. And this isn't something new. Paul had this discussion with early believers. There's a conflict when we start to focus on all the wrong things. But what we find here in Acts is they focused their center around Christ and nothing else mattered. See, what that verse doesn't mean is they literally had everything in common. It wasn't like a cult where they were like, wear your white shoes and your red shirt and drink the Kool-Aid and everything's great. It means that they could set aside their selfish desires for the good news of the gospel. And when we learn to do that, there's a message that flows out of us that people are hungry for. See, it's time for this church to stop pushing people away because of our hoops and start welcoming people in because of the good news that God has given us. There's a power to it. It's the call for the church. Bo has become one of my best friends in Sylvania. I always tell stories because I have like 3 friends here. And but his mom has become like a mother to me. Like I joke about Yaya, who was slaying on the piano today. And when you come over, like, she'll heckle me and, do all the motherly things, but she'll also like lay a spread out for me and it'll be delicious. And but a couple weeks ago, I have not spent a lot of time with Bo's other family. And I spent like 3.5 hours crammed in Bo's little tiny office in his house, sweaty, gross, smelling bad. And we were just laughing and telling stories. Have you ever been in that environment? Where you have 2 families come together. They're Greek to the max, like all the way. I am not like Greek at all, like not even a little bit. And and you can have people from a completely different background just come together, and it feels like family. It feels like you were meant to be together the whole time. And that only happens when we find the common areas of our lives. See, the church needs to find what we have in common rather than what we have divided. And the apostles understood this, and it's why God blessed the work they were doing. And it's why God blessed what was happening in Jerusalem and in all the nations. And when you learn to love in this way, when you treat one another, support one another, you are living out the gospel in your life. But it didn't stop there. See, they selflessly gave to one another, laughed together, and supported one another in every way. So you can't get to each place without starting with number one. If your worship is not aligned, then you can't find what you have in common. And if you don't find what you have in common, you can't support one another. See, there's a flow to it. In Acts 2:45, it said they sold their property and possessions and gave to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. There's times in your life where you just need someone to come alongside you and hold your arms up. There's times in your life where you need someone to come alongside of you and link arms and say, hey, you can make it another day. You can do it. Keep pressing forward. It's like what we talked about last week in service. Sometimes you're on lap 6 and you want to give up, and you need that person to come alongside and say, you know what? You've made it 6 laps. You can go another one. And that's what this verse is talking about. They came together and they helped each other. And the thing is we're all wired for this type of companionship. If you go back to the book of Genesis, God creates everything, and he creates man, and he says he walks with man, spends time with man. They are in community with one another, and God says it's still not good. It's still not right. And so he forms woman. Why? Because we weren't meant to live alone. Everyone needs someone alongside of them to help them, to push them, to encourage them. And this is what it's talking about in the book of Acts. We are literally pre-wired to need one another. And when we learn to embrace that idea, when we learn to lean into one another, then we don't have an option other than to support each other. We hold each other's arms up. And I don't care who you are. I don't care how good you think you have it. Everyone needs a friend. Everyone needs community. Everyone needs help. And I experienced this. I grew up in a broken home. I've shared my story. And I went to college by myself. And I thought, man, I'm going to do it alone. I don't need anybody's help. And I found out real quick how much I really needed help. How much I really needed other people in my life. One of my best friends to this day is a guy named Marco Dennis. And our lives are very, very different. He lives in Florida, and he's a teacher and runs a company. And I live in almost Michigan. We live on the exact opposite sides. But he's still one of my best friends to this day because he changed my life. I went through most of my freshman year just kind of isolated and alone. And one day Marco grabbed me. I was sitting outside and started talking to me. And he invited me kind of into his family. And I was real reluctant, right? When you're meeting someone new, you're like, okay, we can be friends at an arm distance. And I remember him taking me in, and he invited me over to his dorm room, and I thought, okay, that's weird. Like, am I going to get jumped or something? Because Marco's got more tattoos than I do. He's got like everywhere, chest, arms. I'm like, I'm about to die. And this was before I felt tough with my tattoos. And so, influence, right? I hung around with a guy with a ton of tattoos, and now I've wrecked my body. And just kidding, not getting into that. And so he invited me over, and I remember sitting there, and we're just talking and goofing around, and he said, okay, pulls out this piece of poster board, and I'll remember it for the rest of my life. And he started going around the room saying, what do you need prayer for? And he got to me, and I'm sitting there, and I'm like, I'm not saying nothing. I don't even know you people. And I remember our first reaction is to close off. We don't need anyone. We can handle it alone. And I remember sitting there, and he started to pry. See, I believe God was speaking to him in that moment and saying, there's more. There's more. Go deeper. Go deeper. And I'm sitting there. I'm like, no, man, I'm good. I'm good. He's like, no, you're not. And literally, awkwardly, for like 10 minutes, we sat there, and he just stared at me. And I'm like, dude, please go on to someone else. Anyone ever been in that situation where you're like, pass, go away? And he started to dig into my life. What he was trying to do was trying to say, you can't do it alone. He identified it in me. He saw something in me that I didn't really want to go to, and I didn't want to give up. And he started writing out like So I started talking, and God just kind of broke my heart that day. And I started sharing some things about feeling lonely and how, going to school for ministry was hard, and I didn't know if I wanted to do it, and I wanted to quit. And I'm like taking up half the poster board at this point. And then we all came around each other in the middle of a dorm room, a bunch of guys that probably didn't shower enough. And we put our arms around each other, and we prayed for each other. And it was the first time that I had ever put my arms around someone, and this is bad, I'm in ministry school, right? Put my arms around someone and said, I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to help you out. I'm going to be with you. And I remember sitting around in that moment, and God just broke something in me. And I said, I can't do it alone. I need him. And I remember walking out of that room, and he says, Brent, granted, I just met this guy. He says, I love you, man. And I was really like, okay, I grew up in a house where no one said I love you back and forth. Other than your grandma, right? Grandma always says she loves you. Here's a cookie. He says, I love you. And I was like, okay, I'm out of here. And every day he'd say it. Brent, love you. Brent, love you. And it built in a philosophy in me that now I tell everybody. I want to tell everyone. Every time I leave my house, it doesn't matter if Lauren and I have been fighting for an hour and a half about something stupid or something serious. I'm going to say I love you before I walk out of there. Because God is calling us to a better, more authentic version of community where it isn't surface level and you just come in and punch your Sunday card and move on with your life, but where we come together and get into the nitty-gritty of each other's lives and say, you know what? I don't know what background you're from. You're a Michigan fan. I'm an Ohio State fan, but we're going to find what we have in common, and I'm going to support you when Ohio State kicks your butts in a couple weeks, right? I'm going to lift your arms up and encourage you. But in all seriousness, we get into this moment where we want to be surfacey. And God's saying, no, engage with each other's lives, because the blessing I have for you is way greater the deeper you go. If you go surface, you're going to get a surface level blessing. But when you dive in deep and say, I'm going to give everything I have to this, I might get hurt, I might get beat up, but I'm going all in. God is going to give you an all-in blessing. It's time for the church to quit asking for surface blessings and start diving in and saying, God, I want all of it. I want everything. We have this problem in the church. We want to pray for revival. We want to say, God, bring revival. But we want God to really bring revival on Sunday mornings. We want God to really bring revival on our time frame. And God's saying, when you go all in, that's where revival is going to happen. That's where real growth is going to happen. And the new church understood this because they lived it out. In Acts 2:47, it says, they were praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. It wasn't about Carlos's blessings bigger than mine, or Abby's getting a bigger blessing than me. It was saying, we're all getting the blessing, because if Abby's blessed, I'm blessed. If Jim is blessed, then I'm blessed, because his blessing is going to rub off on me, and there's fruitfulness in that. It said they celebrated the blessing of all the people, and the Lord added to their numbers daily, and people were saved. It wasn't the most qualified. It wasn't the best. It was a group of believers, most of them uneducated. You got to remember, half of these guys denied Jesus at the cross. It was the unqualified, broken, hurt people that went all in and said, I'm giving everything I have to this, because there has to be a better way. There has to be more. Church, God is calling us to more. God is calling us to not just be another church down the street. We don't need another church. We don't need more Christians that just show up on Sunday and then do what they want the rest of the week. We need more believers that say, I'm devoted to this. I'm all in on this. I'm bringing as many people I can along. If you had the cure for cancer, you would try to share it with everyone, Because everyone in this room in some way has been affected by cancer. You have the cure for every broken heart, every need, every hurt person, all of the hopelessness that is sweeping through our world. You have it within you. Wouldn't you want to give it to everyone? Don't you want to pull as many people along? That's the depth God's calling us to. So I want to challenge you guys this morning. If we want to see God move in a powerful and mighty way, then as the church, we need to quit operating in silos, and we need to start living in circles. Let me explain that real quick. A silo is isolated, it's its own thing, but a circle, when you put something in a circle, it's stronger, right? What's the Bible say? It's quoted at every wedding. A cord of 3 strands is strong, but 2 is easily broken, right? Because when there's threes, when you have numbers, there's strength, there's power. But when you're going through life alone, it just takes one thing to break you. It's time for the church to start living in this way. So I want to challenge you this morning. In what area of your life, your Christian walk, maybe this morning you're not a Christian and you just came in here and you're like, this guy is yelling and he's crazy and his microphone's not working, but they have a really good band, right? And maybe you're here and maybe you've been trying to do life alone. Maybe you've been living as a silo. And God's saying there's something more. Press in. Press in. Some of y'all have been praying for breakthrough in your life, and God's saying, it's not going to happen living alone. Press in. Some of y'all have been praying for a miracle, and God's saying, press in. Get some people around you. It's not going to happen alone. You got to move in numbers. There's a strength in numbers. If we want to see transformation in this city, it's going to take more than just Anchor Church. We need friends like Compelled Church, Church 321, McCord Christian. All of those are churches that have selflessly supported our church plan and said, we're with you. We'll send people. We'll help you. We'll open up our space. We'll do whatever it takes. Soma City, we just did a team night in their room, and they said, anytime you need it for meetings, use it. It's time for the church to move together. Say, there's something better ahead of us. Let's dive in. So I want to challenge you. We're going to go into this song, and I want you just to take a moment and reflect. If you want to worship. If you want to sit, what areas of your life is God calling you to a depth, a deeper place? Because that's where the church, that's where Acts 2:42, that's where this church, we're going to be an Acts 2:42 church. We're going to live selflessly. We're going to support one another. We're going to give generously because we believe God has something better, not just for us, but everyone around us. And it's contagious when it takes off. So let me pray. Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for this community. God, I thank you for these people. God, I pray that you would just move in this place in a mighty way. God, that you would move in people's hearts in a mighty way. God, you did not design us to walk alone, but you designed us to walk arm in arm. And God, I pray that we would be a church that walks arm in arm together. And God, we invite as many people into the circle as we can until we can't fit anymore, until we have to start more churches, more connect groups, send more people, because God, you are doing something not out of our own doing, but us just being obedient to your word. And so God, I pray that you would stir something within us. God, that we would know that we are better together. God, that we are stronger together. And God, that you would move in a mighty way. In Jesus' name, amen.